President Trump had a rally the other day, his first rally since COVID hit, and he had a moment that I think really should be a much bigger story, and it's really not being talked about almost at all, but here he is, quite literally coming out against the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution.
The left-wing anarchists tore down a statue of Thomas Jefferson. Now we're getting into the real stuff. They decapitated a statue of Christopher Columbus, except in New York when the Italians surrounded it. They didn't have too much of a chance. Those Italians, I love the Italians. They heard they were going to rip down their beautiful Christopher Columbus, and all of a sudden they circled that thing. They didn't do too well in hurting Christopher, did they? Thank you to our Italian population. We're very proud of you, right? 2 days ago, leftist radicals in Portland, Oregon, ripped down a statue of George Washington and wrapped it in an American flag and set the American flag on fire. Democrat, all Democrat. Everything I tell you is Democrat. And you know, we ought to do something, Mr. Senators. We have two great senators. We ought to come up with legislation that if you burn the American flag, you go to jail for 1 year. 1 year. Jim and James, we ought to do it. You know, they talk about freedom of speech, and I'm a big believer in freedom of speech, but that's desecration. That's a terrible thing they do. We used to have things, we don't have them anymore because we want to be so open, so everything, and look what happens. We should have legislation that if somebody wants to burn the American flag and stomp on it, but just burn it, they go to jail for 1 year, okay?
That would be dead on arrival because there was already a Supreme Court case on this in the year 1989. And the decision was that burning an American flag is like quintessential freedom of speech and free protest. Justice Antonin Scalia, who's a far-right justice, he famously said, hey, listen, if I was king, I would ban burning the American flag and I would punish it. But I'm not king, and we have this thing called the U.S. Constitution, and the specific kind of speech that the U.S. Constitution protects is speech like that. Burning the American flag is symbolism of discontent with your government. So to ban burning an American flag is to ban the freedom to express your opinion on the current state of affairs in the country. And he said, listen, my personal opinion is irrelevant on this because we have the U.S. Constitution, we have the First Amendment, which is free speech and free protest and freedom of religion. And what do you want me to do? This is the most crystal clear case. It's clear cut as to what the point of the First Amendment is. See, being a patriot is not burning the flag or being against burning the flag. Being a patriot is understanding that you live in a country that's free enough to let you burn the flag and there are no consequences for that. See, for all this talk, especially, and the right loves to do it, they talk about freedom and liberty and all that stuff. And then when you actually test those principles, and by the way you test a principle is you go to an extreme case. You don't have to test the principle of freedom of speech if somebody goes out there and says, rainbows are beautiful, dogs are cute, apple pie is delicious, and I love mommy. Because nobody objects to that. You have to test the principle on the fringe cases. It is, the Stalinist. It is the white supremacist. It is the person who burns the flag. These are the real tests of the principle of whether or not you believe in freedom of speech. And there's a general rule that you can abide by, and it's pretty much ironclad. Anytime somebody says, as Trump just did, I'm for free speech, but, anytime they throw a but in there, guaranteed they're not for free speech. He's literally overriding U.S. Supreme Court case law on this and the standard interpretation of the First Amendment of the Constitution. Why? For BS faux patriotism brownie points, because his campaign is floundering, he's doing terrible in the polls, and he feels like he's got nothing left. So he's going all in on the culture war. Now, we're going to talk more about this later. Guys, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. The culture war stuff doesn't work in certain instances. We're in one of those circumstances right now. So again, we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But everybody needs to understand something. It's not just Trump. It's everybody on the right who loves to claim the mantle of believing in freedom of speech. See, there's this movement that started probably online going back to, maybe 2012-ish or a little bit after that, where the right started, being the most aggressive, ardent supporters of freedom of speech. Now, why did they do that? Well, the answer is very simple. There was this movement, which at the time was called social justice warriors. And it's not social justice warriors in the context that you might think of it the first time you hear that. When you think of social justice warrior, you think, okay, isn't that like Martin Luther King, fighting for social justice, wanting to fix stuff? Like, isn't that a good thing? No, the term social justice warrior became the description and kind of like a caricature of the person who goes overboard with that ideology to the point where they want to control people's speech, and they want to talk about stuff like safe spaces and microaggressions. And so it was very easy for the right to go after these people. Why? Because usually most of the people who were pushing this kind of, censorship ideology were college-age know-nothings with pink hair who want to be part of something bigger than them, but they didn't really stumble across the super important issues like, imperialism, ending war, fixing our economic system, which is rife with corruption. And they didn't find the stuff to focus on to really be part of something that's bigger than them. So they focused on policing language and microaggressions and safe space and trigger warnings and stuff. So it's so easy to point at these people and say, oh, that's so stupid. That's so stupid. You aren't even okay with people expressing their opinions. I'm for free speech. And this is what these people did for years and years and years and years and years. It's, we on the right are for free speech. The left is no longer for free speech. Yes! Then meanwhile, what organizations have fully embraced, at least historically, this defending this principle come hell or high water? Well, maybe go have a little conversation with a guy named Glenn Greenwald. Certainly nobody's right-winger. He was a First Amendment lawyer. Look at what the ACLU did. The ACLU was so principled on this issue that they even defended white supremacists because they said, the content of what this person is saying is irrelevant. We don't agree with the content. We're defending the principle of freedom of speech, because once you suppress this person's speech, guess what? It's a slippery slope, and you bet your ass they're going to come for the communists, they're going to come for the anarchists, they're going to come for anybody who steps outside a mainstream acceptable opinion. If once you get rid of free speech, why not say, hey, when there's a war going on, it's anti-American, it's unpatriotic, it's sedition to question the war. So now, we're going to lock you up for trying to call out the BS involved in our wars. Once you open that door, there's no end to it. So it's really not, right-wingers who were protecting it all along. Historically, it was more of a left issue. I'll admit that, yes, there was a movement with social justice warriorism that kind of broke away from that and became too identity-obsessed and too censorious. But my point here is the right-wingers who claim to believe in freedom of speech, claim to believe in it, they're absolutely, positively nowhere to be found when there's not just a violation of the principle of freedom of speech, violation of the constitutionality of freedom of speech. Because Trump's out there saying, I want to lock you up for a year in prison if you burn the American flag. So where are all the free speech warriors on this one? Where are they? Where's Dave Rubin? Where's he at? Is he doing a long segment on this? Is he talking about it nonstop? Is he tweeting about it nonstop? Or does free speech only apply when you get to bash pink-haired college kids? And the answer is obvious. It only applies when you get to bash pink-haired college kids. Because the fact of the matter is, when it comes to Donald Trump, he said many times before, I'd like to copy the UK's laws when it comes to speech. They don't have freedom of speech in the American way over there. And so it's much easier to sue for libel or slander or defamation over there. So he wants to copy those things? Well, then he's anti-free speech. This is a guy who threatened to sue Bill Maher because Bill Maher made a joke about Trump that he didn't like. He said something like, Donald, you have to prove to me that, one of your parents isn't an orangutan because of the color of your hair. And so Trump, provided proof to Bill Maher. See, these are my parents. I'm going to sue you. And, you have to pay me millions of dollars. And Maher's like, it's a joke, bro. You're literally suing me over a joke because you don't like that I compared you to an orangutan. That's what you're doing. So this is thin-skinned, petty authoritarian garbage. And there's other issues. There's other instances of Trump, wantonly violating the principle of free speech in the past. Now he's coming for the constitutionality of it and saying, I would lock you in jail for a year if you burn the American flag. This is a debate that was settled once and for all in 1989, but in reality, with the plain-faced reading of the First Amendment of the Constitution, you could argue this goes all the way back to our founding, but look at what he's doing, and I don't hear anything from the people who said they cared about freedom of speech. So just so you understand, it was always a scam, it was always a ruse. These guys are partisan hacks, they're not principled, they never believed in it. If they did, this would piss them off. I mean, seriously, guys, stop and think about it for a second. When there's somebody on the left, or nominally on the left, somebody in the Democratic Party who, let's say, is pro-war, what do? I come out here and I go, this person's wrong. I totally disagree. This is unacceptable. But when Trump goes out there and says, I'm against the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, I don't hear anything from the right. Nothing. And by the way, at a time like this, guys, we need free speech. We need people to be able to get out there and protest against injustices, because if you don't have that, there's no built-in mechanism to fix the system. I mean, we already know our government is corrupt beyond imagination. So how do you fight back against that? Will you use mass movements, mass mobilization, and organization? This is what they did in the civil rights movement. When you get enough bodies out there in the streets, you scare the pants out of the people in power, and then they bend to your will. It turns out when you have thousands and thousands of people calling for defunding the police in the streets, what happens? Even the Republicans go, no, not defund, but we will reform. Sure, we'll reform. I think reform is reasonable. So they're pushing the Overton window. They're getting out there. If you take away the ability of people to protest, you're no longer a free society. You're an authoritarian police state. And that's what he wants. He wants absolute power. He's using this as a wedge, a cultural wedge issue, because he knows that he's got nothing else to rely on, so he's just doubling down on the culture war at this point, because everything else around him is falling apart. And he's at the point where it's the most absurd BS faux patriotism nonsense you can imagine. I love the flag. I think the flag is tremendous. The flag is amazing. And anybody who burns the flag should be locked up for a full year. Why? Because the flag is good. The flag is good. This is the same guy who threatens to sue the media if they write stories he doesn't like about him. Deeply against the First Amendment. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. No ifs, ands, or buts about it, especially with the threatening to invoke the Insurrection Act to stop the rioters. If the military was in the streets of the U.S., they wouldn't just stop the rioters. They would shut down demonstrations full stop, which is against the Constitution. So I don't know how many more ways he could tell you that in his heart of hearts, he's an authoritarian, and that's how he wants to act. Now, you could say he's massively incompetent. That's probably true, because there's so many issues where he wants to do stuff and then he just doesn't end up doing it, or the system goes, we're not doing that, and then it ends. But this is what he's going to use to try to get elected now, and it's pathetic. And I'm honestly annoyed and floored at the fact that this isn't a bigger story. More people aren't talking about it. And these idiots on the right are not standing by the thing that they pretended to believe in all along. You want to know why? Because it's such a clear example of everything they said being a charade. Every single thing. You would think that out of the whole bunch, there's maybe a handful of the so-called free speech warriors who are like, no, I mean it, and that's messed up. Where they at, dog?